Hi guys, so here is the second installment of 423 with regards to second language acquisition, or SLA, as you're seeing in front of you. This week is on relative clause attachment, and I was planning to do it anyway, but I had a chat with Dana, and it's kind of timely with regards to your upcoming assignment, so you're welcome. So, relative clause attachment. To talk about why I want to study this with you guys, let's start with the critical period, which showed up in Linguistics 185, which for some of you is a long time ago now. Sometimes some of you have seen it more recently in different classes. If you took my 317 class, clearly it shows up there, but it's relevant to other classes too. And so let's begin with the question, what is the critical period for language acquisition? So right now it's just language, not specifically second language. So critical period for language acquisition. What's proposed, so any critical period, and there are others, as a matter of fact, because biological functions like language typically have critical periods. A critical period of any sort is a biologically determined period in which something can be acquired, right? There typically is believed to be one for vision. Birds have them for bird song. So critical periods are biologically determined periods in which stuff can be acquired. And for language, in which we are particularly sensitive to linguistic input, ergo we can acquire a language. And it's originally hypothesized, the critical period, to last from birth until puberty. Okay, and there's versions of this, but for right now we're going to behave that it's until puberty. And in fact, there is a case study from the 1970s that was published in a very famous book by, I think it's Susan Curtis, about a girl named Jeannie. And full disclosure, the first time that this was taught to me, people don't say a girl named, they just say, who's Jeannie? And my brain goes, what? Oh, not me. Okay, fine. So anyway, so Jeannie is a girl who was discovered in the 70s. And she has a strict relationship as evidence for the critical period. So if I pose the question, who is she, and what's her relationship with the critical period, the answer is she was a victim of child abuse, of neglect, really, who wasn't exposed to human language for the most part. There was a few commands barked in her direction, but not exposed to human language until after puberty began. So at age 13, she was found. And it so happens that Jeannie never learned a first language. The utterances that she produced or signed, because she used a lot of sign language or signs from sign language, lacked syntax. There wasn't any evidence of hierarchical structure. There weren't things like anaphor principle, nothing really. It's just sort of lexical items used in a really sort of, I guess, survival strategy kind of way. So she never acquired syntax. There was no syntactic structure to what seemed kind of like language. So the critical period hypothesis relates to this. Its original formulation pertains to Lenberg's work in the 60s, although it sort of reappears in different versions. Eric Lenberg, I think, proposed that language can't be learned natively, as to say, like a first language, once puberty begins, due to changes in the brain structure. He talks about lateralizations, and though the exact mechanisms that he discussed aren't relevant to this class, they're very relevant to like Linguistics 310 and such. This evidence does come from aphasias, and that's why it relates a lot to 310. So if you're interested in this, I encourage for you to go out and look for it. But the critical period hypothesis is proposed for language, where you can't learn languages after puberty if you haven't been exposed to them by then, because your brain changes structurally in such a way that you can't. Okay. Now, one interpretation of that claim, not about the physical part, but like the brain function side of things, has to do with access to universal grammar. And I'm not going to get really deep into this particular claim, but what that would mean is if you haven't learned any language ever, you lose access to UG at the onset of puberty. This is a version of this. And so if that's the case, what if you've already learned one, but you're trying to learn another? right? Specifically, is there a critical period for second language acquisition, or does it just pertain to the onset of all language, right? So if, as far as we can tell, if you haven't learned any language by puberty, you're never really going to get something syntactic in your mind. And the question is, if you haven't learned a second language until puberty, does that second language, is it doomed to somehow be non-native like? And that's kind of the question that has been bugging second language investigators for a long time. So the question can be framed this way: is second language acquisition limited in some way by a critical period? Note that a second language learner's grammar and the way that they process language, so their strategies, are often different than that of monolinguals, right? And some of us may have experience knowing that the success rate in second language acquisition, adult second language acquisition, is really lower than monolingual child first language acquisition. If you look at a group of adults trying to learn German and they start at 16 or 20 or whatever, and you look at a bunch of seemingly normal kids exposed to, let's say, their native German, their parents are German, 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 German everywhere, you're more confident that the kids are going to speak German than you are of the adults. That doesn't say they won't, but our confidence is much higher for the kids. Okay, so is that critical period? And so here's the question framed this way: are those differences due to the critical period, or are they due to something else? And if you watched last week's video, as surely you have, you'll see that there are things that differ between first and second language acquisition that perhaps can attribute to this. Is it really the presence of two languages in the mind? Does that change things? So if you talk about the first bullet point where their grammars and processing strategies are simply different, is that due to the coexistence of two languages? And transfer is a piece of that, right? Needing to reset parameters. But processing strategies, we don't know what causes those exactly, right? Certainly something our brain does, but causality is sort of poorly understood in those cases. So the presence of two languages unto itself could be a big piece of that puzzle, what makes it different. And so we also talked, so but far as success rate goes, there's vast differences in the amount of exposure. Not to say that frequency drives acquisition, but exposure is still important, right? And so the kind of exposure you're getting as a kid, which is especially in a monolingual environment, which is everywhere and constant and about every topic you can imagine, that kind of exposure, your mind will go, I think this must be important, and grab onto it in a different way. Whereas if you're an adult in a not immersion setting, you're in a typical second language classroom, you're not getting nearly as much variety, for one. And two, the quality is probably different. It's been adjusted to fit your level. We don't necessarily adjust our speech around kids. To them we might, but around them not necessarily, right? And then the context itself, this natural kind of acquisition versus classroom-oriented acquisition, that also could affect these things. So we don't really know what's causing this. And so the question ends up being, how do we begin to grapple with figuring out if it's surely the critical period or not? Okay. Age of acquisition is kind of inherent to critical period, right? And so age of acquisition literally means the age you start studying something. For second language, it's often sort of conflated with age of arrival, because a lot of second language learners, the ones that have a chance of really being native, like a lot of times, are immigrants, right? People who move to a new place. It's not true clearly of everyone, but a lot of them are. So age of acquisition, age of arrival in many cases are conflated, but age of acquisition purely means exposure and the start of the development of your new linguistic system. So if you're a successful classroom learner, class could be enough. So it depends. So what is the age of acquisition for second language acquisition? And really the answer to this question depends on the category of learner. So there's such a thing as a child second language learner. And we would call a child a second language learner if they begin their other language at 8, right? So these children may have moved to a new place around the age of 8, 9, 10. So that whole range is kind of child language acquisition. Notice how it's before puberty though, so it's kind of fuzzy as to what it means with second language or not, whether it's really, post-pubescent, critical period sensitive. So that's a fun little different group. And a lot of the research that comes out of second language acquisition is different. It's very different. And that in itself is a question. But we're going to set it aside for now as second language investigators have for a long time. We're going to set it over here, okay? And I'll put a pin into it. It has to do a little bit too with bilingualism, which we'll get back to. And so then the other major category is adult second language acquisition. And if we're talking about adult SLA, we're talking about post-puberty. And that can be anywhere from literally 13 on, or the more common definition is like 18. There was a really famous study that defined it as 17, so sometimes you'll see 17, but right in there, about the onset of adulthood. So why we tend to call them adult second language learners or second language acquisition. So what happens if you learn them earlier? And 8 is in kind of this fuzzy area, right? We call that early bilingualism, and sometimes second language acquisition is called late bilingualism. If you're calling someone early, late is sort of the comparison point. But I'm still going to call them second language and early bilinguals, just because I want it to be starkly clear that they're very different groups. And early bilingualism does have at least two major categories. There's a lot of granularity if you really get into it, but let's keep it as far as two, just so we kind of conceptualize the type of people that fall under the category of early bilinguals. One is the simultaneous early bilinguals. This is defined as both at or before age 3, so 0 to 2. And typically this can only happen if in your family both languages are spoken. And you can see how that's culturally a very big deal. And if you're going to talk about early bilinguals, especially simultaneous early bilinguals, it has a lot of sociocultural implications. So sociolinguists are very interested in simultaneous early bilinguals. They're the ones that really emphasize that because it comes about in a very particular way. The other main category is sequential early bilinguals, which, I mean, technically simultaneous can fit inside of this category, but it actually extends the window up until before 6, so like 0 to 5. And this is because this is the age range you get if someone learns one language at home and starts a new one in school, right? Because kindergarten's typically like 5. And the vast majority of bilinguals that you're going to study are going to be in this category, right? They have a family, especially if they have strength in the non, dominant regional language. So let's say French in Maine, for example. Someone who was really going to maintain their French is much more likely to come from a family who's from Canada and only speaks French at home, arrives to school and speaks English. Those people's chances of maintaining some kind of bilingualism is much higher, right? So we like to study that group, but we will keep simultaneous in there too, because some of them do also maintain it. Okay, because if a bilingual doesn't maintain both languages, it's hard to do a lot of research on them. And there's, types you can do, but that's sort of a different discussion for a different day. Anyway, so here you'll see the two main categories. The second one is larger and contains the first, and we're going to focus on the second one, but the first is much more important in sociolinguistics. Okay, so second language versus early bilinguals. What do they have in common? And if you haven't already guessed, they both know some percent of two languages. And this is going to vary widely. It really, really varies. But a second language learner has studied, they learn one at home, and they typically study a second one in school. That's the most typical second language person, right? Some of the people go abroad, etc. An early bilingual either did that the same way except for much earlier, right? Immersion at home and then arrive at school and acquire English or something, right? Or they speak to at home. But the point is they both know some percentage of both. Typically, both groups know a lot more of whatever the dominant language is. So in the United States, that's English. But again, it varies a lot by situation. What is different between these two? Well, obviously, age of acquisition is different because when I'm talking about L2 versus early bilinguals, I mean adult L2 and early bilinguals. And their age of onset is basically, anywhere from, 15 to 18 years of difference. It's just hugely different. So that is huge. So if critical period matters, you can see how age of acquisition would be a good thing to vary between two groups of speakers of two languages. Also, but early bilinguals usually have a cultural connection with both of their languages, even if they're the sequential type where they don't acquire the English or whatever until school age. They are going to have friends in English, so they're going to have some connection with both of those languages. A second language learner doesn't necessarily have that. I mean, for example, in our ASL program, there's a lot of push to develop a cultural connection with the ASL community, with the deaf community, because this kind of tips the scales more in your favor to be like early bilinguals. Not necessarily that you're going to have an outcome like them, but it's more like that, right? There, that naturalism comes back in. Okay?